Humanity had always been a species on the fringe of the galaxy, a young, inexperienced race that had only recently earned the privilege of being invited to the Galactic Council. To the ancient and powerful species of the galaxy, Earth was little more than an insignificant, developing world, still caught up in the chaos of its own primitive wars and technologies. The Council itself was composed of races far more advanced than humanity, beings whose technology could bend the very fabric of space and time, whose weaponry could erase entire fleets in an instant, and whose understanding of the universe was centuries ahead of Earth's. To them, humans were a curiosity, a fleeting spark in a cosmos filled with the brilliance of millennia-old civilizations. The first time Earth's representatives sat at the Council's grand table, they were met with more than just indifference. The advanced alien diplomats, some of whom had never encountered a species so technologically backward, could barely hide their condescending smiles. As Earth's ambassador began to speak of Earth's contributions to peacekeeping and defense, it was clear to everyone in the room that the words were falling on deaf ears. The alien species exchanged knowing glances and half-formed chuckles as the human delegation detailed the state of their planet's weapons and defense technologies. "Let us clarify the situation, Earthling," said High Commander Jin, the towering leader of the Karath, a race of hyper-intelligent beings known for their mind-linked combat strategies. "You claim to have made significant advancements in weaponry, yet your weapons are little more than crude, blunt instruments compared to the technology we possess." He sneered slightly as he glanced at the human representatives. "A few hundred years ago, your people were fighting with clubs. Now you have energy rifles that can barely pierce our shields. What exactly makes you believe these weapons could defend a single planet, let alone protect your species from a galactic threat?" The room fell into silence as Jin's words hung heavily in the air. The other delegates, from the shimmering, liquid beings of the Xandrians to the silent, fleet-footed Talarai, exchanged amused glances, no doubt reveling in the human embarrassment. The humans could do little but stand their ground, knowing they had little to prove in a galaxy that viewed them as a primitive species. The human delegation had one advantage: they weren't just representatives. Among them was Sergeant Mark Kane, a battle-hardened soldier who had spent decades in combat on Earth. He was older than the other representatives, grizzled and worn from his time spent fighting in wars against far more formidable foes. Kane wasn't one for speeches or diplomacy. He had seen enough of the galaxy's cruelty to know that words meant little. Actions, however, could speak volumes. His presence alone had made an impact on some of the more skeptical members of the council, though they didn't show it. When it was Kane's turn to speak, the room briefly fell quiet. He had said little so far, sitting with a calm and reserved expression, almost as though he didn't belong there. He wasn't interested in the politics or the pleasantries of this meeting. His mind was already elsewhere, calculating strategies, thinking about the kind of people he had lost back on Earth, wondering if any of them were still alive to witness this day. "Commander Jin," Kane said, his voice steady and firm. "I know exactly what you think of us. You think we're weak. You think we're unprepared. You see Earth as an underdeveloped species, a collection of dust compared to your shining stars. But I can tell you one thing, this dust has an uncanny way of surviving when no one else expects it to." Jin's lip curled in a half-smile, clearly unconvinced. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms as if waiting for the human to say something worthy of his time. "You mock our weapons," Kane continued, his gaze unwavering, "but let me ask you this, when was the last time you had to use your so-called advanced technology in a fight for survival, where everything depended on your wits, your instincts, and your will to fight? When was the last time you had to face an enemy with nothing but sheer determination, where your advanced technology failed to give you an edge?" The other council members shifted uncomfortably, their gazes now shifting between one another. They had been in battles, yes, but they had never fought like humans had, outnumbered, under-equipped, with their backs against the wall. Their victories had always been guaranteed, their enemies easily crushed beneath the weight of superior firepower. The idea that a species could win a war with mere ingenuity rather than sheer force was foreign to them. Kane stood up, his massive frame towering over the table. He wasn't tall by alien standards, but there was something in the way he carried himself, something that resonated deep within the hearts of every species in the room. He didn't need to flaunt his strength or pride. He had seen what the galaxy could do to the weak. He had fought on Earth's battlefields when hope had seemed lost, and he had survived against all odds. "Commander," Kane said, his voice low but filled with a quiet intensity, "I don't carry the kind of weapons you're used to. I don't have the luxury of energy weapons that can disintegrate entire planets, or shields that could withstand an asteroid. What I carry, though, is something you will never understand. A weapon that was born in the trenches, from a time when survival was all that mattered." He gestured toward his side, where a shotgun, Earth's oldest, most reliable weapon, rested beside him. The room was suddenly filled with stunned silence. The delegates, most of whom had never even seen a weapon so primitive, stared at the shotgun with a mix of confusion and amusement. They whispered among themselves, wondering if the human had truly lost his mind. Shin laughed openly, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "What is this?" "A joke," he said, gesturing to the shotgun. "This is what you believe will protect your species in the face of the galaxy's greatest threats? You think your species' survival depends on this thing?" Kane's expression remained unchanged. He didn't flinch under the ridicule. Instead, he simply said, "You've never had a shotgun to your face, Commander. But if you did, you'd understand exactly why it's still one of the most powerful tools a soldier can have." The room fell silent again. The other council members exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to respond. The human had just turned the ridicule into an unanswered challenge, but no one could figure out how to counter it. Kane returned to his seat, the tension palpable. The human delegates looked uneasy, knowing that Earth's chance of being respected by the council was rapidly slipping away. But Kane didn't care about their respect. He didn't care about the council's mockery. He cared about Earth's survival. And in that moment, that shotgun wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of the human spirit, of humanity's refusal to be underestimated. The debate continued, but for the first time, the council began to listen, not to the humans' words, but to the unspoken message behind them. The Kurath and the other species were not accustomed to hearing anything but praise for their superiority. But they were about to find out that Earth's strength lay in something far deeper than technology or weaponry. Humanity wasn't just another species in the galaxy, it was a force to be reckoned with, and it would not be dismissed so easily. The shotgun had become a symbol, not of what humans lacked, but of what they had in abundance, an unbreakable will to fight, no matter how impossible the odds. And the Council, still laughing at Earth's weapons, had no idea that their galaxy was about to change forever. The hum of the galactic war room was broken only by the faint murmur of voices as representatives from across the galaxy gathered in hurried consultation. The Council's usual sense of calm had been shattered by an emergency transmission. An ancient alien race, the Zorath, had returned. The Zorath were a race of near-immortal beings, so old that their technology and biology had fused in ways the galaxy had never seen. They had been thought extinct, their last known war wiping out entire fleets of the Galactic Council's finest soldiers centuries ago. Now, the Zorath had resurfaced, and their intentions were anything but peaceful. The Council, for the first time in centuries, found itself in a state of confusion and panic. The Zorath were nearly indestructible. Their ships were immune to most modern weapons, their bodies evolved to resist even energy-based attacks. When their scouts entered the edge of Council space, the galaxy's most advanced species scrambled to deploy their forces. They had faced numerous enemies, but nothing like this. Nothing like the Zorath. "None of our weapons will have an effect," said Rock, the leader of the Talarai, his voice strained. The Talarai, a race of swift, telepathic beings, had never faced an opponent so impervious to their advanced weaponry. Their fleet, despite being the largest and most technologically advanced in the galaxy, had already found itself at a severe disadvantage. "Their shields are impervious to our energy weapons. We need another solution, and fast." The Council's war strategist, an ancient being known only as the Archivist, began to speak. "We've already deployed our best ships. The Zorath cannot be beaten by sheer power alone. We'll need to outthink them, use tactics the Zorath aren't prepared for. We'll have to The archivist's voice trailed off, realizing the gravity of the situation. No one in the room had any real idea of how to defeat the Zorath. Their technology was too advanced, their methods too alien. The idea of defeating them using traditional warfare seemed like a joke. It was then that the human representative, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Monroe, cleared her throat, cutting through the rising panic in the room. She had remained quiet until now, absorbing the conversation with a sharp focus. "I understand your concerns," she began, addressing the council, "but I believe you are overlooking something important." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the human delegation. Monroe was a career soldier, one of the few humans to have ever been invited to sit at the Galactic Council table, and her presence there was only because the humans had volunteered to help defend the galaxy from the Zorath. She continued, her voice steady but firm, "I know you believe that only advanced technology can win this war, but you've made a critical mistake. It's not always the weapons that matter, it's the tactics. You are fighting a race that relies on brute force and overwhelming power. What you need is surprise. The Zorath are predictable in their arrogance. They rely on strength, but they don't anticipate what a species with nothing to lose will do." The council members exchanged glances. The Zorath, in their infinite arrogance, had always conquered their enemies through overwhelming force. None of the advanced races had ever been forced to think outside the box because they were never outmatched. Earth, on the other hand, had been fighting wars with limited resources and outdated weapons for centuries. And it was that resourcefulness, that ingenuity, that Monroe believed could make the difference. "Surprise," Monroe repeated. "We have strategies that your fleets wouldn't consider. Guerrilla tactics, misdirection, unconventional methods. If you let us fight our way, we can buy time for the Council to regroup. We may not have your advanced technology, but we've fought enemies far more powerful than ourselves. And we've won." The room fell into silence once more, the weight of her words lingering. The human strategy, while unconventional, was an idea that hadn't even been considered by the Council. They were accustomed to defeating their enemies with superior force, not by outsmarting them. Sergeant Mark Kane, a man of few words but great experience, rose from his seat. He had been quiet up until now, but his presence in the room was impossible to ignore. His body was scarred from decades of warfare, a lifetime spent fighting wars on Earth's blood-soaked battlefields. The humans, in their desperation, had turned to soldiers like him, those who knew what it meant to fight for survival when no one else would. Kane's voice was low, but it carried a weight that made every council member pause. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "You think Earth's military is nothing more than a joke. You laugh at our weapons, our methods. You think we don't stand a chance. But I've fought enemies that could wipe out entire fleets with a thought, enemies with powers that could shatter worlds. And we beat them. Not because we had better weapons, but because we had the will to fight. We don't have your fancy tech, but what we have is something you can't replicate, our resourcefulness." Kane turned toward the center of the room, his hand resting on the side of his shotgun, the weapon that had become an unspoken symbol of humanity's determination. "This here," he said, his voice steady, "is a weapon older than your species. But you've never had one aimed at your face. You've never fought with everything you have, because your technology has always made up for your weaknesses. It's time to fight differently." A few members of the council exchanged skeptical glances, but the look in Kane's eyes told them something different. He wasn't just another soldier. He was a survivor, and he believed in the power of his people to outthink the enemy. "You've never fought like we fight," Kane continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "We're not used to the luxury of big ships or energy weapons. We fight on the ground, face to face with enemies who have far more power than we could ever hope to have. We use our surroundings. We use everything at our disposal. The Zorath might be able to destroy your fleets, but they won't expect us. And that's how we win." The room was still for a long moment, the council members contemplating what had been said. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Rock spoke. "We will allow you to try. But you must know this, if you fail, the galaxy will fall. Earth's failure will mean the end of us all." Kane nodded, unfazed by the heavy weight of the Council's expectations. "We won't fail," he said simply. The plan, once dismissed as laughable, was set into motion. Sergeant Kane and his team of elite soldiers were placed at the forefront of the attack, their mission simple but critical: take the fight to the Zorath, disrupt their command structure, and buy the Council enough time to regroup. They would be fighting without the advantage of advanced weaponry or shields, using only Earth's most basic weapons and the unique tactical mindset that had allowed humanity to survive time and time again. The human soldiers moved quickly, disappearing into the darkness of the battlefield as they prepared for their assault. They would be using guerrilla tactics, ambushes, misdirection, and swift strikes to break the Zoratha's cohesion. They were not concerned with playing by the Zoratha's rules. They would bend the rules to their will. Meanwhile, the rest of the galaxy's advanced fleets moved into position, but there was a sense of unease. The Zorath had already proven their superiority in battle. The fate of the galaxy was now in the hands of a handful of humans, fighting with nothing but their ingenuity and their unshakable resolve. It was a gamble, one that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. But as Sergeant Kane looked at his soldiers, ready to face the Zorath in battle, he knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't go down without a fight. The first strike came without warning, a sudden assault on the outermost Zorath fleet that sent ripples through the Galactic Council's forces. The Zorath ships were sleek, formidable, and nearly indestructible, their hulls immune to any energy weapons or high-powered projectiles that had been previously deployed. The Council's ships, with their sophisticated technology, had been rendered useless in the face of their alien adversaries. As the Council's fleets retreated to regroup, the human soldiers led by Sergeant Kane were already deep within enemy territory, their small but highly trained unit executing the strategy they had rehearsed tirelessly. The Zorath had never expected this, never expected that humanity, a species they had dismissed as weak and primitive, would be the one to challenge them in the way that they did. The humans didn't fight the way the Council did. They didn't rely on technology, ships, or superior weapons. They relied on something the Zorath had never encountered: human ingenuity and the raw will to survive. Sergeant Kane and his team had been dropped onto the Zoratha's central command station, a massive structure floating in the void of space. It was heavily guarded, teeming with Zorath soldiers and automated defense systems that were nearly impossible to penetrate. But where the Council saw an impregnable fortress, Kane saw an opportunity. The plan was simple: infiltrate the command center, sabotage their communications, and throw the Zorath forces into disarray. The Council's fleets would be waiting for the opening. As the team made their way into the station, they moved with a stealth and precision that no alien force could match. They didn't have the technology to cloak themselves or hack into the Zorath systems with ease, but they didn't need it. They knew how to use the environment to their advantage. They moved silently through ventilation shafts, using the narrow confines of the station to avoid detection. They set traps along the way, primitive yet effective, explosives rigged to sound alarms, decoy signals to mislead the enemy, and jammers to disrupt the Zoratha's communications. One of the soldiers, Corporal Jenny Marks, had always been the strategist of the group. She understood how to create chaos, to manipulate an enemy's perception of the battlefield. As they moved deeper into the heart of the Zorath station, Jenny used a set of basic human tools: wire cutters, electromagnetic pulse devices, and handcrafted explosives, to disable the station's defenses. It wasn't the most elegant of tactics, but it was effective. Every move they made was designed to confuse the Zorath, to force them to expend resources on responding to phantom threats instead of focusing on the real assault. They encountered their first set of Zorath soldiers in a narrow corridor. The Zorath were humanoid in shape but far more imposing, massive, armored creatures with 4 arms, each brimming with advanced weaponry. The humans had no time for stealth now. They were deep enough inside the station that retreat wasn't an option. Kane signaled for his team to take cover. The shotguns they carried, seemingly outdated weapons, became their primary defense. The close-range nature of the shotgun was perfect for the confined spaces of the station. The first shot rang out, echoing off the metal walls of the corridor. The Zorath soldiers, used to facing enemies who relied on energy weapons or advanced projectiles, were unprepared for the raw, brutal power of the shotgun blast. The impact sent one of the Zorath soldiers sprawling back, his body crumpling in a heap. The other soldiers responded quickly, firing energy blasts from their gauntlets, but the humans were faster. Corporal Marks hurled an EMP grenade, causing the Zorath's energy weapons to malfunction. Kane, with a shotgun in hand, blasted another soldier at point-blank range. The battle was over in seconds. The humans had taken down 3 of the Zorath soldiers without suffering a single casualty. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And it sent a powerful message: the Zorath had underestimated humanity. They weren't prepared for this kind of combat, for the human soldier who would stand his ground no matter how overwhelming the odds. As they pressed forward, Kane knew they didn't have much time. The Zorath were smart, and it wouldn't take long for them to realize they were under attack from a force they couldn't even comprehend. Kane's team needed to get to the central control room and disable the station's communication systems, preventing the Zorath from calling reinforcements. They reached the control room, a massive chamber filled with consoles and advanced alien technology. The human soldiers worked quickly, planting explosive charges and setting up jammers. Kane moved to the central console, his hands moving swiftly over the alien controls. He didn't understand the language or the technology, but he knew enough about human ingenuity to make it work. He had been trained to adapt, to use anything at his disposal to accomplish the mission. 5 minutes, Corporal Marks called out from her position, scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. "We need to move out now." But Kane didn't budge. He stared at the console, his fingers flying over the alien interface. He was close, so close, to disrupting the Zorath's command structure. Just as he was about to trigger the final sequence, an alarm blared throughout the station, a deafening siren that echoed in every hallway. The Zorath had detected the breach. Reinforcements were on their way. Kane's mind raced. They didn't have 5 minutes. They had 30 seconds, maybe less. The human soldiers moved into position, ready to fight their way out. Kane didn't look back at his team. He knew they could hold their ground, but there was something more important now: they had to finish the mission. He hit the final key, and the station's communication grid went dark. For the first time since the Zorath had returned, they were blind. Their command center had been cut off, and they were vulnerable. The Council's fleets, waiting on the edge of the system, would now have the opening they needed. "Move out!" Kane barked, grabbing his shotgun and leading the charge. They had to leave the station, but they didn't have to survive. The mission was all that mattered. As they fought their way back through the corridors, the Zorath poured in from every direction. But the humans were no longer the hunted. They had become the hunters. The Zorath couldn't match the ferocity and unpredictability of the humans. Kane and his team set traps, ambushed their enemies, and used the station's narrow passages to outmaneuver their attackers. Finally, they reached the hangar, where their escape ships awaited. The Zorath forces were closing in, but the humans had made their stand. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that could destroy them without hesitation. But they had accomplished what they came to do. The station was in disarray, its communications severed. And the Zorath were no longer an unstoppable force. Kane and his team boarded the ship, exhausted but victorious. The escape was far from clean, and there were losses along the way, but they had done it. They had disrupted the Zorath's command and given the Galactic Council the chance they needed. As they escaped into the void of space, Kane looked at his team. They had proven that humanity, for all its flaws, had one thing the Zorath didn't: the ability to fight, adapt, and win. The battle had only just begun, but now the galaxy had a new understanding of Earth's soldiers. They weren't just a weak species relying on outdated weapons. They were a force to be reckoned with. And the Zorath, for all their power, had just learned that the hard way. The Galactic Council watched in stunned silence as the first reports of the human team's success reached them. The Zorath, who had once been considered an invincible force, were now reeling. Their command center had been sabotaged. Their communications had been severed. The Council's fleets, having regrouped in the wake of the humans' ambush, were finally given the window they needed to strike back. The tide was turning, and the galaxy's most advanced civilizations were starting to see Earth in a new light. Back in the war room, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Monroe stood before the Council, awaiting updates. The weight of the situation still hung in the air, the fate of the galaxy was on the line, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. The Zorith, once seen as the unstoppable force, were now in disarray. But there was still much to be done. The human soldiers, led by Sergeant Kane, had given the Council an opening, but it would take more than just one successful operation to turn the tide completely. "We need to capitalize on this," Monroe said, her voice steady but urgent. "The Zorith are vulnerable now, but we must move quickly. We can't afford to waste any time." The Council members exchanged nervous glances, many of them still unable to fully comprehend what had just transpired. They had seen the humans' tactics, but they had not yet grasped the full depth of their resolve. The Council had always relied on superior technology, superior fleets, and superior firepower. But the humans had just proven that it wasn't always about what you had, it was about how you used it. It was about the will to survive. Sergeant Kane's team had already begun their next phase of the operation, moving deep into Zorith territory to carry out further sabotage. The mission was perilous, and the stakes were higher than ever. There was no going back now. Kane's team was on the front lines, a small but determined force taking the fight to the heart of the Zorith fleet. Kane himself sat in the command center of the human ship, his hands resting on the controls as the others prepared for their next assault. His face was grim, but there was a fire in his eyes that refused to be extinguished. This war had cost humanity everything, and Kane had lost comrades, friends, and family along the way. But he wasn't about to let it all end in failure. Not after they had come this far. "Everything's in position," Kane said, his voice calm but resolute. "We take out their core, cripple their supply lines, and force them to fight on our terms." The team had been briefed on the mission, and they knew exactly what needed to be done. They had to target the Zorith's central command ship, the flagship that controlled their entire fleet. Without it, the Zorith would lose their coordination, their strategy, and their ability to communicate with each other. It was the key to ending the war. If the humans could disable the flagship, the Council would have the chance to finish the fight. The task was daunting. The Zorith flagship was heavily guarded, its defenses unlike anything the humans had faced before. But they had learned from their previous encounters. They knew how the Zorith thought, how they operated. They had seen the flaws in their strategy, and now it was time to exploit them. Sergeant Kane and his team infiltrated the flagship, using the same guerrilla tactics they had perfected during their earlier assaults. They moved quickly, silently, cutting through the defenses with precision. Their shotguns, unremarkable to the Zorith, but deadly in the hands of the humans, were their primary weapon. With every step they took, the humans reinforced the idea that the Zorith were not invincible. The humans weren't going to fight like the Council expected. They weren't going to fall into predictable patterns. They would take what was given and make it their own. Once they reached the heart of the flagship, Kane and his team placed the final charges, designed to disrupt the Zorith's power grid and cripple their systems. As the countdown to detonation began, the Zorith forces outside the flagship were starting to rally. But it was too late. The humans had already done what they came to do. The flagship, once a symbol of the Zorith's invincibility, was now a target of humanity's unyielding determination. Kane turned to his team, his expression unwavering. "Get to the escape pods. We're leaving." The detonation was inevitable. The flagship would crumble under the weight of the human attack. But the escape was far from easy. The Zorith were already responding, sending reinforcements to the flagship in an attempt to save their command center. They didn't understand that the humans were already one step ahead. The humans weren't trying to win with sheer force, they were trying to outlast, to survive, to outwit. As the escape pods launched into space, the Zorith flagship exploded in a brilliant flash, its destruction sending shockwaves throughout the fleet. The Zorith forces, now thrown into disarray, scrambled to reorganize. The Council's fleets, which had been waiting for this moment, moved in swiftly, taking advantage of the chaos. The once unstoppable enemy was now fighting a losing battle. Back at the war room, Lieutenant Colonel Monroe watched the reports pour in. The Zorath flagship had been destroyed. Their command ship was no more. The human soldiers had pulled off the impossible, and now the Council's fleets were pushing forward, engaging the Zorath in a series of devastating attacks. Victory was within reach, but Monroe knew better than to celebrate too soon. The war was not over, and there were still countless battles to be fought. Sergeant Kane and his team had given the Galaxy the chance to win, but they had paid a steep price. Many of the soldiers had not made it out of the Zorath flagship, their sacrifices marking the turning point in the war. Kane had survived, but only just. His face was bruised, his body battered, but there was no doubt in his mind, this was the moment humanity had been waiting for. The Zorath, for all their power, had underestimated the one thing they couldn't control, human willpower. The Zorath had been blinded by their own superiority, thinking they could crush Earth with their advanced weapons and technology. They never realized that it wasn't the weapons that mattered, it was the heart behind them. As the last of the Zorath ships fell to the Council's forces, the Galaxy stood on the precipice of a new era. The humans had proven that they were not just another weak species in the vast expanse of space. They had shown that their ingenuity, their resourcefulness, and their refusal to give up were qualities that no alien race could ignore. The Galactic Council, once full of doubt and arrogance, now saw Earth for what it truly was, a force to be reckoned with. The humans had saved the Galaxy, but they had also saved something more important, their place in the Galaxy. No longer would they be seen as weak or primitive. Humanity had earned its respect, and in the process, had earned its future. Sergeant Kane looked out into the vastness of space, the stars stretching out before him. The war was over, but the journey had only just begun. Humanity had fought for its place among the stars, and now that they had it, they would never let it go. The Zorath had learned that the hard way. And so, the Galaxy would learn the ultimate lesson: never underestimate humanity.